I'm Jonathan Larson with TYTI Investigates, and there's a lot going on today. Dr. Fauci is testifying before a Senate committee about the response to the coronavirus. We've got Supreme Court cases, arguments going on involving Trump's tax records. And I was tempted to do all the sort of usual what's trending, what are people talking about stuff. And I was involved in some of T.Y. Chang's reporting and some of my reporting over the last few days. And so it had been bothering me that I had not really engaged in the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And so I wanted to talk about him and his death today. And so I did what I usually do. I tried to do some research. I read in a little bit on some of the coverage, some of the names and the places, some of the background, and all of this stuff. And there's a new video out there today, maybe it came out yesterday, showing Arbery apparently on his run, it looks like, walking into a still under construction home. Doesn't take anything, doesn't do any damage, doesn't commit any crime. People are saying, well, it's trespassing, and I'm not even sure that's true. If there's no door, for all we know, he wanted to tell the owner, hey, I saw, a problem with your flange or whatever the hell, right? It was potentially just as innocuous as walking up to someone's door, constructed door, and knocking on it. And eventually I began to feel a little uneasy kind of dissecting his background. And I realized that what I was doing on some level was I was looking for evidence that he was the perfect victim. And if you haven't heard the phrase before, the perfect victim refers to it's unfortunately unjustified violence against Black people, especially by people in authority, is common enough that we have a name for the syndrome of requiring that the victim have no blemish whatsoever in the incident itself or in their background before we're willing to say the actions of the people in authority, whether it was official authority or whether they were assuming authority, need scrutiny. And I realized I was doing that, right? That's what I'm doing when I look at, well, what was his background? Did he have anything in his background? All this stuff. Even when you see the phrase, and it's a very mainstream phrase, you see the phrase, an unarmed Black man was killed. The unarmed is put in there as a way of conveying information that's seen as relevant. But the relevancy of that information is, it's relevant to the question a white person asks of, was there some reason maybe to kill this guy? And so I began to think about what drives that impulse, and I began to think about, you don't have to explicitly, overtly, consciously hate Black people to demand that they have no blemishes in their background in order to be afforded the justice they're due. Even the most woke white person, the biggest ally, can still not want to believe that there is racism in the world, or even that there is the kind of thuggery and unwoke vigilantism that can lead to these things. We don't want to think that. So when we look for these details in the victim, in a way what we're also doing is we're looking for things that would in some way exonerate the white perpetrator or suspect. Because we don't want to think that, right? We want to think, oh, they must have had some excuse. Please give me some excuse. And I saw an interesting post on Twitter to this point that said something like, this only happened because there's a video, and the point they were making was that the white world at large requires the sacrifice of a Black body. And seeing it, That's part of that sacrificial ritual before we will afford justice, before we will even entertain the notion of presumption of innocence, which is something we don't even require of any other victim. And the ultimate upshot is that whether the shooter went out hunting KKK style or has Barack Obama stickers all over his pickup truck and just wanted to help the community by looking out for the community, the black man is just as dead. His family is just as torn apart, not just emotionally, but the personal connections that ran through that person, the economic earning potential of that person, his children, whatever children he were to have. All of that is blown away, regardless of whether the person thinks they're woke or not. And I began to think about what drives people to do that. And it's I began to think not just about what drives a KKK member. We know what drives that person. To me, what's more urgently in need of litigating is what drives the person who's not all the way on that spectrum. What narratives do we create that enable and justify behavior that's somewhere on that spectrum? And if you tell someone, as we have been doing for 19 years, if you see something, say something. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And then you wrap it up in stand your ground and all this other stuff. What you're doing is you're building a chain. And I wrote it down because I wanted to be able to follow it through here. Because at each and every step, in theory, if you accept all that vigilante stuff that we've been telling mainstream America, our own government has been saying to do this, if you accept all this, then if you see someone suspicious in your neighborhood, why wouldn't you approach them, address them? And if they resist, thereby ramping up, and by resist, I mean ignore you, walk away, I don't mean hit you, even just if they don't comply with your demands as a deputized agent of the US government, which is what we've been doing for the past 20 years, right? When we said, if you see something, say something, we know who you meant, right? So if they see someone suspicious, why wouldn't they ask that person what they're doing? And if that person tries to run away or ignores them, thereby ramping up the suspicions, why wouldn't you attempt to detain them for law enforcement? And if that person resists now physically and goes for your gun, why wouldn't you defend yourself? Stand your ground. We've built this ladder that leads to lynching and mob violence because we've exalted each and every step. We've told ourselves that we live in a country where crime is rampant, right? Let alone that they couldn't even find any crimes in that county or in that neighborhood, whatever it was. Again, I didn't do a lot of research because we shouldn't have to. But there was one crime reported. The suspects apparently said, well, he resembled, Arbery resembled a suspect in a recent string of robberies. I don't remember whether it was burglaries or cars being broken into. It wasn't even an actual robbery where one person physically confronts another. But even those minor crimes that they were supposedly policing against didn't exist. This was apparently a utopia. But we have so fearified, we have so terrorized, because bin Laden won, we have so terrorized our own people that they think not only that crime is bad all around them, our kids are crap, they're all criminals, they're all spoiled and they're all criminals. Forget what the statistics actually say. Not only have we taught them that, but we've taught them you should do something about it. And we've taught them zero tolerance, right? We send 5-year-olds, black 5-year-olds more than white 5-year-olds, we send black 5-year-olds not to the principal's office if they've got a knife in their backpack or something like that, something that they had no intention of using, found at home or whatever. It might be a kitchen knife for all we know, and there's a cop. And if they're a couple years older, now they're in juvie, right? Because zero tolerance, because we're such babies, we're such terrorized babies, that we can't stand the thought that something bad might happen somewhere that we don't want to happen. And therefore, we're willing to do terrible, terrible things in the name of that. And I tried to think about what I have to say about this that's of any use. And I guess all I can say is, it's not enough to cry racism, and it's not enough to lament these things happening. We have to, I think in some senses, reject victim defending and stop certainly requiring perfect victims, of course, but also stop even litigating, like, why does it matter, right? We don't even ask these questions if someone else gets shot, if a non-black person, or I should say a white person, gets shot. We don't even ask these questions. Well, what were they doing, right? To defend or to implicate. So I guess, and the other thing I wanted to say was, we've also built this system where the Reagan joke occurred to me, right? The Reagan said something like, the scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. And what that does, the reason that's so pernicious, it's so insidious, is it says, I'm going to take away from you the one thing that everyday people have, which is an actual mechanism to help other people. That's what government is for. The government is our collective project for helping people. That's literally what it is supposed to do. And by pooling our resources, we can address things like getting an expert opinion on what are the problems we should be addressing and what are the solutions. So when we reject government as a mechanism for helping, we're not only rejecting the collective power of government, we're rejecting the resource of expertise. And now we're saying, you're on your own, so you decide what the problem is. You decide what the remedy is. You don't have a master's degree in jack-all. You've got a storied history of terrible freaking judgment in your own personal life. But you know what? You decide what's important and you go out and fix it. And so I think part of what the real meaningful woke approach to this has to be is to start accepting, to give up zero tolerance, right? To say essentially what Trump has said about the coronavirus. Meh, people die. That is true. And we do make that trade-off. The point here is not to accept a higher number of people dying. The point here is to say the problem is not so bad that we need your help. We are at a point where we are lucky enough in our society that we don't need people's help. We are actually worse off when ex-cops and their kids aren't riding around armed looking to solve problems that aren't there with guns. So I think that's something that we have to do. Like, and I extend that to the coronavirus, where, you know, everyone is out there banging pots and pans out the window at 7 p.m. or whatever. The answer is very simple. Pay people more money. And the way you do that is to raise taxes. Like, if you really want to be woke, you say, I want taxes raised. You can say on the rich, that's fine. If you don't have the money to kick in, you can say, I want taxes raised on the rich, but say that. The rich people and corporations should pay more taxes, and we should use it to make sure that no child goes hungry, to make sure that no child is left unattended because a parent has to work, I mean, in theory, we could even get crazy enough and go back to how it was in the 50s and even the 60s, where a family with no college education could survive on one spouse's salary. All right, I'm going to shut up now. Because like I said, I didn't read in on this and I have no expertise. I just went down a rabbit hole of my own approach to this and I wanted to share. And I hope I didn't stumble and say something offensive along the way. But if I did, tell me, right? Because that's the project we're supposed to be engaged in, is getting better. And part of the process of getting better means being able to speak freely enough about it that we can expose where our thinking is off track, right? So now I'll go find out from the chat where I went off track. And thanks everyone for being here. Grayson Gagliardo says Ahmaud had malicious intent and was not minding his business on a jog. Video proof shows he trespassed multiple times, even at night. Okay, let's address this. Not minding his business is not a crime, okay? The fact that you require murder victims to have been minding their own business, that may or may not reflect you being a racist, but it absolutely makes you an idiot and a terrible person if you're not willing to change your mind. I'm going to leave that gap for you. If you realize that it's a horrible, horrific thing to say about humanity, that if anyone's not minding their business, they're subject to a white man's decision that they get to die, right? And by the way, video proof shows he trespassed. Trespassing is I believe it's a misdemeanor offense, but he was not convicted, okay? So now you're also showing that you're willing to convict someone of a crime they have not been convicted of. So you're also willing to deny them due process. So you're willing to have people killed for things that aren't a crime, and you're also willing to deny due process before convicting people of things that are low-level crimes. So, Grayson, you need to rethink yourself in a very big way. Work on it. Weena Jensen says, TYT uploaded a clip the other day. 50% of comments were not only, I guess, unapologetic, vile, racist, and hateful, or maybe apologetic on behalf of the killers. They also gave you the uncomfortable feeling that you were in Mississippi burning. And that's I think, a big part of the problem, is that it's really important to think about what is it that weaponizes racism. If we assume it's latent, and I don't mean because it's taught, and in fact, I think there's something to be said for not suggesting that it's taught, right? What if it's something that's there, not necessarily about color, but just about differences, right? What if just the latent xenophobia of anything different, anyone different, is triggered by things like there's a lot of crime, and we should do something about it. Weena Jensen says, it looked like a hunting. A hunting serves a purpose. This does not. I would disagree on hunting for sport. But the style is the same: corner the animal and attack from two sides. Jess says, watching that video made me think of the Hunger Games. And I actually didn't want to watch the video, both because I get, maybe this is something as I get older, the heartbreak, the tragedy, and the powerlessness of watching it play out and not being able to stop it is hard. It's difficult. And there's two arguments to that. One is, too bad it's hard. You think it's hard for you? Like, you should submit yourself to that, right? Force yourself to watch that so you see what's going on. And then the other argument is that argument I saw online the other day, that there's something off about requiring the visual experience of the sacrifice of the black body. That I don't know. My thoughts on this are uninformed and incomplete. Jin Denton says this innocent jogger killed by the police, former police, is not that different than the Sandra Bland incident. She was publicly tortured and murdered in the jail instead of the street. Fatima Smith says his sin was the color of his skin. Damn shame. Kalita points out, remember Trayvon Martin? He was no angel. And that's the sort of classic phrase that you literally would see in newspaper articles about kids who had been killed. They would say, you know, his family admitted, you know, he was no angel. What the hell is that? What the hell is that? Can you imagine if anyone had said that about Sharon Tate after the Manson murders? Jin Denton is telling a harrowing personal story in the chat. If you want to go check that out. I'm sorry for your experience, Jin. Arcane Blue says, I got turned down from a police job because of that same scenario. I had a record of having a butter knife in my backpack from middle school. I'm sorry about that. Kalita says, by the way, if you need money to make your argument, you've lost the argument. That's what I was saying last week about lobbying. I'm not sure I'm following that, Kalita. Sorry about that. Arcane Blue says, zero tolerance makes zero sense. Fatima Smith says Trayvon Martin was a kid, which again, yes, he was a kid, but this is why I feel like we need to stop defending the victims. Because when we say he was a kid, by implication, we're saying he was more entitled to our mercy, to justice, to being left alone, than if he were an adult. Adults are allowed that too, right? We're driven by a good impulse to come up with reasons they should have been left alone. He was minding his business. He was a kid. The absence of our defenses are not exculpatory. They don't make it okay. So I almost feel like we need to stop defending, right? And if anything, I'm not even sure what to do about it, but I think maybe just have the discussion for a start, right? Maybe we need to start questioning the defenses when those details are put in there, because the implication is without this or without that would have been worse. If Trayvon Martin had had another birthday under his belt, it would have been that much less okay to murder him. Kalita says, yes, indeed, that is not expected from white victims. Only dark-skinned victims are expected to be angels. And I do think that part of that comes from a place of white privilege, of not wanting to confront or to admit or to live in a world where that's the case, right? So we look for things that provide these like extenuating circumstances. Well, he ran into a house. Now, the person commenting online obviously was using that to basically say he deserved to get shot. That was someone who's clearly not on a good part of that spectrum of white racism and white supremacy. But even just rendering that judgment, right? Even sitting there and saying, I'm going to find out what the facts are here so that I can render my judgment. That's a form of white supremacy. Who the hell are you to render judgment? They don't need our defense. They need our defense before anything happens. And to do that, to really defend them, we have to dismantle this entire mindset that's become especially toxic after 9/11. We have to say, you know what? Don't stand your ground, stand down. Why? Because you're not the government. And the government is where our trust in this kind of stuff resides. You don't have the training. And I don't trust your instincts. I don't trust your common sense. Looks like we've got company. You know, we have this thing like common sense is this guide that we should follow. But the reality is most of human history was given to us by common sense, right? Company towns, feudalism, you know, medieval torture, the Dark Ages, all of this stuff was common sense at the time. Common sense is crap, and we need to stop exalting that kind of thinking. We need to stop saying crime is a problem. It's not a problem. It's a small problem, right? It's something we want to address. It's something we want to prevent. But let's stop sending cops everywhere, right? We would be better off. We would have less crime if we had a more robust social system to help people instead of showing up with guns, right? Imagine if we cut most of our police forces in half, sold off their tanks, and used all of that money to instead employ a cadre of trained people to help mediators and social, social workers, people who could show up and de-escalate situations, people who could show up and help out with situations, rather than demand people comply when they're emotionally disturbed or mentally unwell at that moment, or need help or off their meds, whatever it is. If we stopped thinking about government or policing as this thing of we must make sure nothing bad ever gets done by anyone, and start thinking about what's the best approach to these problems, and stop assuming that the other is bad, right? If we start realizing that our own fears and our own fears about deprivation, fears about others, those are the things that drive us. If we can stop being so afraid, we'll stop having this stuff, at least not as much of it. Kalita says, ContraPoint and Sean both did a great segment on Trayvon Martin. I confess I did not see that. I am not a big consumer of video commentary, I should confess. Someone said dunk the like button, which I will never argue with, at least when it refers to our videos. Thank you. Sorry guys, I got a little bit lost. Rebecca Cowan says, you are spot on and I love your dog. Thank you for that, Rebecca. I haven't done the videos down here lately, and so I forgot to bring her upstairs. So when we got the doorbell ringing, she went a little nuts. It's so funny. She was super quiet the first few years we got her. And now, if anyone comes in the door, she's protecting us and barking. Even though, if the person comes in, she does nothing about it other than bark. There's literally no bite. It's not that her bark is worse than her bite, there's no bite. Sorry guys, I'm just skipping over stuff for about my dog. I'm a bitch says, thank you for this. It's a start. I hope you'll elaborate on that a little bit, Ima. And thank you for the kind words. But I'm curious to hear where you think it goes next. Because if it wasn't clear, I don't know how to deal with all of this stuff. Reptile Z says the Real News Network out of Baltimore hits these topics hard. Great stuff. Weena Jensen says usually a racist will claim he's a realist. A true realist faces problems and deals with them in a practical manner. No one wants to admit to being a racist. We all know deep inside it's wrong. I think if you're an actual realist, you will admit that there's racism in you. There's white supremacy in you. And if you're not white, that you've got your own isms that you're wrestling with, right? It's pretty famous within the black community that there's discrimination by black people against other black people with darker skin. So everyone's got to confront this stuff. And the first step to that is not denying it. So we all, I think, need to step down a little bit from policing it in others and talking a little bit more about where it is in us. Alice Murphy says, I very deliberately didn't watch it. I don't want to see a person's life end, and I don't want to desensitize myself and begin to normalize it. I wrestle with the same things, Alice. I understand the kind of thinking you're talking about. Oh, Kalita points out that earlier I disagreed with money out of politics, talking about lobbyists. I just don't think that it's possible. I don't think we've ever had a system in human history where money didn't find a way to influence things. So I don't think that the right approach is to get money out of politics. I think, in a way, it's almost like I talk a lot about what I like about the Founding Fathers setting up America as a system for imperfect, selfish people to fight, and out of that fight comes something greater than the sum of its imperfect parts. And I feel like we need to figure out something that does the same thing for money, right? Whether it's radical transparency on the part of candidates, I don't know. And not necessarily legislating that, but just demanding it. I don't know. Troy Von Klingler says, all leftists play the perfect victim. It's a game to them. I'm not sure what that means, but that's my fault in part because I'm terrible at keeping up with what the phrase leftist means versus socialist versus liberal versus neoliberal. I'm just terrible with the labels. And I think it was DLJ or D Scully, one of the D's, I think, tried to school me on this stuff, and I'm not a good student on it. I apologize. I get the concepts. I just tend to forget which names attach to which things. Jess says, if we applied the so-called no-tolerance laws to politicians, DC would be a ghost town. I think there would still be some people there. I tend to be suspicious of generalizations, universal generalizations like that, and I think it's easy to demonize all politicians. I think it's really important to make a distinction between the ones who should be demonized and the ones who should not. And again, when we demonize all politicians, we're again feeding into that narrative of politics is bad, government is bad, we'll take care of it. If I see something, I'm going to do something about it. Fiasco says, this guy needs to cut the soy out of his diet. I can see the plummeting testosterone levels through the screen. First of all, Fiasco, I'm so flattered that you're looking at me through a lens of my sexuality. So thank you. Hat tip right back to you. No way, he says, your packages are here, meaning the doorbell. I don't know. Maybe not. We'll see. Theron Mayo says, can't blame this on video games. Shada Ra says the people who killed Arbery need to either be put under the jail to be forgotten about or receive the death penalty. I should say that I'm on the record like anyone cares. I'm anti-death penalty. Kalita says people should be more willing to work together rather than allowing to be controlled by a police force that is pretty much a military occupation. Well, if people are working together, they won't have that kind of police force, right? People need to be involved in politics for things like, what do you want your police force to be, right? Police doesn't automatically have to be, stormtroopers rolling into town in armored personnel vehicles. Kalita says maybe look into abolitionists, people who want to abolish the police force altogether. Might be interesting to get their perspective. Yeah, I'm entirely sure that there is a rational, reasonable approach to the problem of crime that literally doesn't involve police. And I'm not exactly sure what it is, and I'm not sure that you can have it in a society, in a culture where if you don't have food, you will die, where if you don't have money to buy food, you will die. But I'm also not sure that it wouldn't work. So that would be interesting. Gira Brown says, JL, your dog has been a highlight of this chat, LOL. I can't argue with that. Never, what is that saying? Never perform with kids or animals. They always steal the show. Theron Mayo says, I think the first step to prevent this is to hold police accountable so people that want to act like cops learn before they act. Jess says, all isms are based upon irrational fears. John Ward Jr. says, I appreciate what you are doing, but as a black man, you can see why me and my family have chosen to opt out of pretty much everything. So John, thank you for that. And I feel like I entirely sympathize with the impulse to opt out, but while I can sympathize with and won't judge that, I would ask you not to. The really hard thing about this is it takes a lot of people. It takes a lot of people to bring about real change. And every person who opts out is someone who not only makes that effort, reduces that effort by one head, they're also not getting other people to be involved. And we lose the sort of exponential potential that you could bring to that. So please opt back in, right? Because even if we succeed, and this is something I talk about a lot too, we're always supposed to be trying to get better. So even if the problems aren't heartbreaking, even if no one's dying as a result of injustice, as humans, we're always going to feel bad about the state of things. We're always going to be invested in the project of making things better. And what that means generationally sometimes is that older folks laugh at what younger people complain about. But that's just because they're looking through different windows at their reality, right? Older people might be comparing the injustices that younger people are complaining about to injustices that aren't even around so much anymore, right? So the younger people are just, their scale is different. So I think it's really important to stop denigrating younger people when they apply what we see as an inordinate intensity of response to a problem that we might agree is not great, but it pales in comparison to the things that we dealt with. Well, yeah, and the things that you dealt with paled in comparison to the things that other people dealt with. And I'm not suggesting that the arc of the moral universe is constant, Obviously, there are dips and ebbs, and we are in the middle of one of those. But it's really important not to denigrate when young people look for things to be offended by, right? That's our job. We're supposed to look for things to be offended by. We're supposed to look for ways that we can treat each other better. We're supposed to look for language that's more sensitive to the experience of others. We're supposed to look for things to be offended by, right? That's what more perfect union means. It doesn't mean there is such a thing as a perfect union. It means we're supposed to always strive to get better. Okay, I think I'm all blathered out, but let me see. Maybe I'll maybe what I'll do is stop responding so much to everything. Weena Jensen asks, so what is the conclusion to the perfect victim headline? The conclusion is everything I had to say before, which is that it's not only bad to insist that the victim be perfect, but when we search for evidence of their perfection, we're propagating that. Free Assange says, Larson, are you locked down? How are you finding it? So I've always worked, well, not always, but my job at TYT means working from home. So it's not too bad for me. I no longer live in New York City, so I'm outside the city, so I can go for a walk if I want to. So I have it much better than I think a lot of people do, especially folks living in the city. I am a little worried about elderly relatives who live in, one who lives in the city, others who live in other places. But besides that stress, you know, it's not too bad for us. John War says, see, exactly what DL said is one of the reasons why me and my family, as well as others, have chosen to opt out. Will leave me alone and will come you in amongst ourselves and each other as black people. Theron Mayo says, lobbyists are not all bad. Right. To lobby is something that we do all day with each other all the time, right? We lobby for things that we want. Mommy, can I stay up late tonight? That's lobbying, right? It's just asking for things that you want. So yeah. So Theron Mayo continues on, perhaps lobbyists with corporate funding are the worst. What about the lobbyists with evangelical funding? Weena Jensen says, this whole issue is so layered and steeped in American history. As a European, it's just mind-blowing. We do not have these problems. And yes, you do, which is okay with me. You might not have the same flavors, but Denmark, Sweden, Norway, pretty much any country, especially with all the refugees that have come in the last several years. Shad Ara says, I'm a hunter, so I know what a hunt looks like. Those a-holes hunted that young man. They even brought a video camera to document their hunt. Why can't people see that? So I don't think it's been established that the video camera was brought along with them, or whether it was a neighbor. I don't think that's been established. But also, I'm not sure it helps to do this sort of like conclusion stuff. It's all part of we end up in that same space of litigating, was it okay for them to shoot or not? The answer is, if you shoot someone on the street, you're going to get arrested, right? You're going to get arrested, and professional police are going to find out. And if the cops don't even arrest you, then ultimately, as this should have a while ago, it's going to go to other authorities, right? This is a breakdown by a lot of people. Where were the local politicians in these towns? Where was the media? And kudos, by the way, to the local radio station that posted this video. But the fact that someone was killed and no one apparently was raising a stink about it, that's a problem. Theron Mayo says, I opted out for 35 years. I regret it. Weena Jensen says, out of control gun laws. Weena Jensen says something nice about me and TYT, so I'm not going to read it because I'm going to get all flustered and my testosterone levels are going to go down even further. Okay. Thanks, guys. I hit the end, and I really appreciate people, especially Black people, chiming in, sharing your thoughts. If you're watching this after it's live and you can't be in the chat, I hope you'll share your thoughts on what I've said. Like, you know, hit me back on track if I got off track somewhere, if I screwed up, if there's information that I don't have, if there's a viewpoint that I've missed, please share. Please do so in the comments. And in the meantime, there's a lot going on right now, so it's really important that we pay attention to the stuff that matters and not just the stuff that makes us angry in the moment because Trump shouldn't have said that. So that's one thing we can do. We can also take care of each other, take care of ourselves, and we'll be back again tomorrow. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you don't already, here at TYT Investigates, and we'll see you tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time here on TYTI Daily.